So now we want to begin to discuss auctions. And you can view auctions as simply an application of game theory. In fact, we're going to look at auctions and compute things like best responses and dominant strategies. But actually, this topic is really much more than that. We're going to use auctions very frequently throughout the rest of the class. So let's talk a little bit about what auctions are and how they work, and for that matter, how you should behave in them. First, you see auctions used actually a lot. Not everything is sold by an auction, of course, but one common example of things that are sold by auctions are things on eBay. eBay actually has a mix of fixed prices and auctions, but many items are sold on eBay by auctions. The U.S. government uses auctions to sell treasury bills, a huge market. They're actually auctioned off. The U.S. also uses them to sell oil leases and leases of the wireless spectrum, and actually a number of countries do this for spectrum leases. Perhaps most famously is that Google uses keyword auctions to generate the vast majority of its enormous revenue. And we're going to talk in some detail later on about exactly how those keyword auctions work, because we're going to talk about what Google actually does. Those three classes of examples, eBay, treasury bills, and leases, as for that matter, as well as Google, were auctions where we had a seller trying to sell something. But actually, you can use auctions on the flip side as well. You can have a buyer who auctions off the right to sell an object to the buyer. The governments, the U.S. government in particular, often uses auctions as a way to procure items. We're going to focus on auctions from a seller's point of view, but you could easily as well do this from a buyer's point of view. First question to ask about an auction is, why would a seller ever use an auction? I mean, there are lots of goods that are not sold by auctions. When you go to the grocery store, you don't see the grocer standing there auctioning off loaves of bread. There's just a price. The seller announces a price, and you can buy it or not at that price. So why do some things sell at fixed prices and others sell at auctions? And the primary reason is that the grocer has a pretty good idea of a very stable and consistent demand for bread, and the grocer really has a good idea that if you announce a price, here's how many loaves of bread you're going to sell. For some items that's true, for others it's not true. Keywords in Google are a really good example of this. Google would have a very hard time pricing every single keyword and anticipating the demand for that. So auctions are often used in cases where the seller wants to sell an object, and we're actually going to focus on selling a single object, and where the seller knows their buyer's interested in buying the object, but the seller just doesn't know the values the buyers place on the object. We're going to assume that every buyer knows how much they value the object, but they don't know others' values. So the seller doesn't know anything about values. He doesn't know what they are in particular. Every buyer knows their own value, and that's all they care about is their value. They don't know the other values. In addition to thinking about whether or not to run an auction, a seller has to decide what kind of auction to run, and there are actually lots of kinds of auctions. There are roughly four general classes. First, there are ascending bid or English auctions, and this is really the most common one. This is what you see on eBay, for example. Right, where bidders, if they want to try to buy an object, have to simply keep increasing the bid until at some point it stops and the item is sold to the person with the highest bid. There is, however, a descending bid auction. These are called Dutch auctions because they're used in Holland to sell flowers on the wholesale market, where the auctioneer starts at a very high price and then lowers the price until someone finally says, "I'll take it." And the person who says that buys the item at the price at which they've said, "I'll take it." That's one class of auctions. Those are often auctions that you can imagine being performed with a group of buyers around and just yelling things out. There are also sealed bid auctions, which initially were auctions that are called sealed bid because people wrote values on a piece of paper and sealed them up in an envelope and sent them off. These days they're more likely to be electronic, but still sealed bid. A very common form of auction of this sort is a first price auction. Everybody decides how much they want to bid. They turn the bid into the seller. The seller sells the item to the person with the highest bid, and they pay their price. There's also, and actually very importantly, a second price sealed bid auction. The same rules, except that the item is sold to the person with the highest bid at the second highest bid. That's why it's called a second price auction. At first glance, this would seem like a very strange thing for a seller to do. Why sell at the second price instead of the top price? In fact, actually, this is a very important kind of auction because of the way people will choose to bid in this auction. So now that we've actually talked about the kinds of auctions and why sellers might use them, let's begin to analyze what happens in an auction. As I said, it looks like we have 4 kinds of auctions, but actually there are only 2 types because of equivalence between these various types. First, the descending bid or Dutch auction is actually, in terms of outcomes, exactly the same thing as the first price sealed bid auction. Okay? The reason for that is something you can see when you think about what a bidder does in this auction. In a descending bid auction, the bidder has to decide when to jump in and simply buy the item at their own price. When you do that, all you know is that you're the person who's willing to pay the most and you're going to buy it. That's exactly the same in a first price auction, that's sealed bid. When you turn in a bid, if you win, you're the person who bid the most, and that's actually all you know, and you buy it at your bid. Those 2 auctions are actually equivalent. They produce the same outcomes. Now, how you should bid in an auction like this is a little bit complicated. You clearly want to bid less than your value for the object because you're going to pay your bid. If you bid your value, you actually win essentially no surplus. So you bid less than your value. How much less than your value depends on a lot of details of the auction, and we're not going to do the analysis of that because we actually will rarely look at auctions like this. Instead, we're primarily going to look at ascending bid auctions, that is the English auction, and second price auctions. We're eventually going to see that those 2 auction forms are the same in terms of outcomes, but this is going to take a lot more work. Let's begin with ascending bid auctions and figure out how you should bid. And this one's actually pretty easy, at least in terms of how you should bid. If you have a value for the object, the question is, as the bids of others are rising up towards your value, when do you stay in and continue to try to outbid people, and when do you drop out? Okay. Well, suppose that the bids are already above your value for the object. Then you shouldn't be in the auction. You should be out already, because if you win, you've in fact lost. You paid more than the thing was worth to you, because to win, you've got to bid more than your value. Think about what happens on the other side if the current bid that's highest is below your value. Well, then you have an opportunity perhaps to buy it at a slightly higher bid than the current one, still less than your value. You would like to do that. You want to buy it anytime you can buy it for less than what it's worth to you. So you should stay in. In fact, what you should be willing to bid in an ascending bid auction is anything necessary up to your value, but never more than your value. If you think about that, what it really says is that staying in the auction until the bid reaches your value is a dominant strategy. Notice in this logic, we never really talked about why other people were bidding the way they're bidding. It doesn't matter why they're doing what they're doing. You always want to stay in until your value is reached. That's exactly a dominant strategy. The other thing we've now just done for ascending bid auctions is we figured out, once we know the values people have, who's going to win the auction and how much they're going to pay. The auction is going to be won by the person with the highest value, and they're going to pay the second highest value, right? Because as prices go up, the person with the second highest value is going to drop out right at their value. So the person with the highest value is going to be able to win at that point or slightly above it. That's going to be the highest bid. So the highest value person wins at the second highest value. That's the outcome in an ascending bid auction. Next, we'll talk about the slightly more complicated auction of second prices, and that will be our next topic.